Let's go straight to Bryce Green. He's always worth hearing from. He's a political analyst and a contributor to Fairness. He's an independent man, and that's the kind of man we like. Bryce, I was talking to Chris Hedges earlier about the meaning of the result last night in Michigan. Before we turn to the Middle East per se, what about its impact on the American presidential race? How do you analyze that yourself?
Well, it's very interesting. Even before this Gaza genocide started and Joe Biden started being even more unpopular, it was a really open question as to how voters were going to respond to the Biden reelection campaign. There were rumors about whether or not the Democratic Party is going to replace him with someone who's more popular, more likable. Because even looking at the numbers before October 7th, Trump was beating him head to head in many important states. And so the idea that people are surprised that Joe Biden is now so much less popular because of this devastating policy in Gaza. I mean, it's just frankly ridiculous. Voters have been signaling that they're unsatisfied with the status quo, both domestically and on foreign policy. But the party establishment in the U.S. of the Democrats really has a lot of disdain for the people that they consider to be their constituents. Even now, after this stunning result in which the uncommitted people turned out tens and tens of thousands of people in a key swing state. Even after this, you still have Democratic Party officials talking about how it doesn't matter and how these people have nowhere else to go and how well they're going to have to vote, suck it up and vote for Biden if they don't want a Trump term. That's really the only thing that they've been able to offer. That's the only thing that Biden has been able to offer his entire presidency. The idea that he's not Trump and that he's holding back the floodgates of something far worse. But voters are starting to get wise and understand that that's just pure rhetoric. That the Biden administration, like most of the Democratic Party, has very little to offer the general public in America, and even less to offer the people who care about human rights and peace and stability and justice around the world.
This lesser of two evilisms approach, I've never bought it, actually, ever, because I don't want evil to win at all. But it would be difficult to make the case that Joe Biden is the lesser of two evils in this case, wouldn't it?
It is certainly difficult. Now, on the domestic front, I think it's very easy to point out that even though the Biden administration has been a disaster, there are many policies, many agencies, regulations that have been significantly better than the Trump administration, and that can't be ignored. But the real question for voters is whether or not these domestic wins outweigh the foreign policy that the Biden administration has been pretty unrepentant about. The policy in Ukraine, for example, to push a country into war, to refuse to negotiate, and to escalate the war, causing an entire country to be destroyed, basically. That's not very popular with voters. And this idea of supporting a genocidal, ethno-nationalist, fascist regime in Israel, who clearly don't care about human rights, and is the overt support for the genocide, well, that's not very popular with voters. And so, if a voter is wondering about the question of whether or not Joe Biden is a lesser or two evil, well, they have to weigh: are these domestic concerns in which he's slightly better than Trump? Do those outweigh the devastating foreign policy that's gotten tens of thousands of people killed, threatening to kill many more, and he seems to have no breaks. He seems very committed to the policy that he's set on, and there don't seem to be any adults in the room either in Ukraine or on the issue of Palestine. And so, will the Trump administration be worse? Well, that's again an open question. Domestically, like I said, there's no doubt that he'll be far worse than the Biden administration is, however bad he currently is. But on the foreign policy, well, it's an open question. Uh, Not to say that Trump is a peacemaker or a friend to the Palestinians, but he's certainly unmoored by some of the ideologies that govern the bipartisan consensus on foreign policy. People might forget this, but a few weeks before the October 7th event, Israeli papers actually reported that Trump had actually explored the idea of using leverage against Israel, using all the aid we have against Israel. Now, he was clearly talked down from that position. But the fact that he's not as ideologically committed to some of the sorts of things that the neocons and uh, the bipartisan consensus are committed to, it might open new possibilities. Now, this isn't to be taken as an endorsement of Trump, mind you. I still think he's a dangerous character. But right now, the person pulling the trigger on all these dead Palestinian children is Joe Biden.
It's a paradox, isn't it? Chris Hedges was explaining that Netanyahu has nothing but contempt for Biden, is hoping that Trump will defeat him, and considers or treats Joe Biden as a kind of laughing stock, at least behind his back. And yet Biden seems to love him so much. What's the love affair between the Democratic Party and Israel all about?
Well, it's hard to say how much of that love affair is genuine admiration, genuine belief in the idea that Israel is the quote unquote only democracy in the Middle East, or how much of that is just genuine anti-Arab racism. But a sizable chunk of the relationship between the Democratic Party and the state of Israel and the lobby that represents the state of Israel domestically, a sizable chunk of that relationship comes from the sheer volume of power that that lobby has. And it's not just the Democratic Party, of course. The Republican Party is just as committed to the state of Israel as the Democrats are. Congressmen from both parties alike have to fill out a form for APAC listing their positions on Israel. But the fact is that for most politicians, supporting Israel is the path of least resistance. They don't care about all the human rights that they'll talk about. They don't care about whether or not people are being bombed in the Middle East. They don't care about whether or not children are getting their limbs severed and scattered around the city block. They don't care about that. What they care about is how easy it will be for them to win re-election in the future. And once you have a lobby that's able to mobilize millions of dollars, that's able to mobilize phone calls and voters, well, then it makes it a pretty easy choice for someone, again, who's amoral and doesn't care about right or wrong. If they want a re-election, well, then they have to appease the lobby. Simple as that. And I think that that is the largest single contributing factor to the ongoing support for Israel and the genocide that they are hell-bent on perpetrating.
Now, Biden said, whilst licking an ice cream, that there was going to be a ceasefire on Monday. Well, that's only a few days away. And the Palestinian resistance groups say they don't know what he's talking about. So does Qatar. Was it just idle chit-chat over a mint chocolate chip ice cream? Or does Biden know something the rest of us don't?
Well, Biden may know something the rest of us don't, but there's also an equal chance that Biden simply made it up or doesn't know what he's talking about or maybe heard something incorrect. I think we've all seen enough of his mental state to understand that some of the things he says may not be sanctioned by his staff or by his advisors or anything else. They're just off the cuff. He's got that old man syndrome going. But the interesting thing about the ceasefire discourse is that there's been a lot of propaganda going around. In fact, you just look at the New York Times recently. They'll talk about how Hamas has rejected a ceasefire offer. And that seems to be exactly what Israelis want Americans to be talking about, how Hamas has rejected a ceasefire offer. But if someone were to actually read the terms of the ceasefire offer or read the record about what Hamas has been offering and what Israel has been offering over the last 5 months, well, then it seems pretty clear that the labeling Hamas as rejecting the ceasefire is just pure propaganda. What Hamas rejected was an Israeli proposal that would temporarily pause the fighting and see the release of many hostages, but would guarantee that the fighting would continue and that Israel's assault on Gaza will continue. The very thing that Hamas has been trying to avoid since this entire conflagration began. On day two, on October 9th, Hamas was talking about exchanging all the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire and a lifting of the illegal blockade around Gaza that has been going on for uh, almost 20 years. But Israel rejected that. They've said explicitly over and over again that their goal has nothing to do with getting the hostages. It's about removing Hamas and removing any political leadership from the Palestinians so that they can, accept their subjugation without raising their heads. That's what Israel wants. And in fact, you've seen this if you pay close attention to the press.
You're breaking up, at least in
Netanyahu
my
said,
ear. Yeah, go on, Bryce.
well, Netanyahu said days ago that even if a hostage deal was reached in with Hamas, the Israeli forces would still go in to Rafah, where millions of people are sheltering and hospitals are being attacked. They're still undergoing bombs. But Netanyahu said that even if they give up the hostages, they're still going to bomb them. Well, what does that tell you? A, it tells you that they don't care about the negotiations, because obviously saying that would decrease Hamas's likelihood of actually coming to the negotiation table. But it also means that they don't care about the hostages in general. If they're willing to torpedo negotiations in order to fulfill their genocidal ambitions, well, then the hostages are very clearly just a PR tactic for American audiences, a talking point for Western media figures to justify Israel's brutal attack. But as I keep pointing out to people, Israel has killed more hostages than they've rescued. They've killed several by their own direct fire. Israelis who were shouting at Hebrew or shouting at soldiers in Hebrew, Israel killed them anyway. There have been reports, unconfirmed, some of them, about Israel's targeting of the tunnels where these hostages lie. According to Palestinian sources, Israel's already killed several of the hostages underground. And it seems pretty clear that many of the hostages who were about to be taken to Gaza after October 7th were just mowed down by Israeli Apache helicopters. And so, unless you haven't read all of this, or unless you're actively and willfully ignoring it, this idea of Israel waging a war to get the hostages is complete bunk. It's complete nonsense. They're waging a war of extermination, trying to rid the Palestinians of political leadership, trying to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians off their land, and implement a regime of ethno supremacy from the river to the sea. That seems to be very clearly their goal, and they've written about it. We've even seen leaks from the Israeli intelligence ministry that said explicitly that the best option for everybody is to simply expel the Palestinians. And it's interesting because they said that this is the preferable option because it means that they'll have to kill fewer Palestinians. In other words, as far back as November, Israel, their plan was to kill as many Palestinians as possible in order to get them to leave so that they don't have to kill the rest of them. And that is why you won't see any serious talks about a permanent ceasefire from the Israelis. And that is why you're seeing headlines in the New York Times and other places about Hamas rejecting a ceasefire. You have to disinform the public if this charade is to continue. And that's what Israel's been doing.
It's going to be a hot potato, though, Bryce. Ramadan is just around the corner. Gallant, the defense chief, has said that the invasion of Rafah, a small town, by the way, but now with 1.9 million refugees in it, in tents or living on the street, if a full-scale Israeli invasion of Rafah takes place during Ramadan, have the Americans any idea of the tumult that that will create and cause all over the Muslim world?
I think they do know. I think that many of them simply don't care. And the ones who do are powerless to do anything within the Biden administration. Again, the true cost of the Israeli assault on Gaza is unknown, but the numbers that we have paint a pretty clear picture. And Biden administration officials have access to the same internet, the same newspapers, the same YouTube that we all do. They know what's going on, and they know what other countries around the world are thinking about it. In fact, probably more than me or you. But they're still willing to continue this insane policy, which tells me that Either that there are forces within the United States government who don't care about doing actual diplomacy, even if it is to maintain the evil empire, even if it is to maintain their influence around the world. It seems that this devotion to Zionism and this devotion to Israeli ethno nationalist project has trumped even those concerns. And so that even if it means that every country in the world will view the U.S. as a undeniably rogue state, a terrorist state, and irredeemable pariah, they don't seem to care. They seem to be embracing it, in fact. You'll see all these headlines about how the world is standing with Israel, how the world is behind Ukraine, how the world believes in freedom and democracy. But what they mean by the world, of course, is some European countries, Australia, Japan, and the United States. If you look at the actual world and what the actual world thinks, one need only go to the United Nations to see what the world thinks. And the world has been trying to stop this war, not only since October 7th, but since 1948. The world has been trying to stop this war. And if you look at the UN resolutions trying to promote a just solution to the refugee crisis, trying to promote a Palestinian state, trying to promote what's essentially the international consensus on Palestine, every year there are a few outliers, and they're led, of course, by the United States and Israel. So that's the world. It's really the world versus these Western powers. And I think the American leaders, they understand that, and they don't seem to be doing anything to change that. They seem to be openly embracing it for better or worse. And one of the issues that isn't discussed much is just how much this policy, this insane maniacal policy, could lead to nuclear war. Not only is Russia a nuclear power and the U.S. is, uh, provoking Russia, they provoke them into war and they're continue to escalate in Ukraine, though that seems to be in question these days. But they're provoking a nuclear power. And Israel, of course, has nuclear weapons, even if the State Department chooses to bury its head in the sand and snicker at people when they ask questions about the Israel nuclear problem. Uh, they know that Israel has nuclear weapons, and they know that Israel is one of the single most rogue states to ever exist, other than the United States. And so, creating a dangerous situation in that region, not only could it inflame the other countries, but it could also cause Israel to panic if something were to go outside of their plans, if something were to the minds of the Israeli officials and intelligence and military, in their minds, threaten the state of Israel, well, then nuclear weapons could be used, and it's very difficult to predict how that could end. But it should be the goal of any sane statespeople to avoid a situation like that from even arriving. But the Biden administration, the Blinken led State Department, all of them, they seem to be just fully on board with endless escalation, just the same in Ukraine, and it seems to be the same here in the Middle East.
Bryce Green, brilliant as ever. Thanks for joining us.